Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who have joined us over the past few weeks, welcome back. If you're new to all of this, welcome. It's Global Ivey Day. I'm Mark Healy. I'm the Executive Director of the Ivey Academy. I wanted to take a moment to thank all of you for the tremendous support you showed the school since the world changed in the middle of March. We know, lots of you have competing priorities right now. We sincerely hope you've gotten some value from these live streams and from everything else you've engaged with the school. And, we hope you get some value again today. Before we start, I also wanted to acknowledge some important work and some important folks in our community. The faculty and staff at the university are really doing some great things in research and in thought leadership. We hope that's making some impact and will continue to do so. Then there are also the folks out there in our communities wearing gloves and masks every day to ensure that we can buy groceries and have water, and people in our communities with healthcare needs get taken care of. And so we really tip our hat to all of you. The whole school's behind you. Thank you for what you're doing. Before we dive into today's topic, I also want to take a moment just to talk about the Ivey Academy itself off the hop. Sean, maybe you could share the slides. The purpose of the academy, we don't talk a whole lot about that, but we're here because we believe that the world needs better leaders and Canada needs better leaders. And we took a look at the Canadian economy and competitiveness and the position that we're in, and we feel like we can play a meaningful role in sort of ushering Canada along and into a better space. And that, I think that's particularly true in this crisis that we're working our way through. So our vision is to truly be the Canadian player, the dominant and premium player in the Canadian executive development space. And at that point, I think I'm going to introduce today's topic. So we're going to get going. We're going to be talking about organizational resilience today. We're lucky enough to be joined by three smart and famous, and I would say very good-looking Ivey grads. Sean Ackland-Grant's also with us here today as our executive producer. He'll keep the train on the tracks. And leading the discussion, we're lucky enough that we have the Academy's own faculty directors. That's Professors Martha Mesnevsky and Dave Laurie with us today. So Martha and Dave, over to you.
All right.
Super, thanks. Hey, great to see everybody. Yeah, why don't I start with resilience? And I'm seeing a couple things that we might have some connections broken in that, but we'll just keep going. And I know that Sean will figure that out in the background for us. Resilience is a huge topic today because of this volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environment, VUCA environment that we have right now. Resilience is about being steady and persistent under enormous stress and strain. And we know it's just really important for leadership and for organizations. And we're all really being tested on this right now. The question that we want to ask today is how can organizations build resilience? What can leaders do to help? And what impact does resilience have? And before I turn it over to you, Dave, I also want to give a shout out to Lafarge Folsom, who has more than 100 people registered for today's webinar. And it's a company that's shown a lot of resilience over the last few years, not just the last few months. So nice to see you all over the world they're here from. Fantastic. So what are we going to do, Dave?
Great. So listen, as we've been flirting with it, let's just go ahead and jump in and say we're so lucky and happy to find three really interesting alumni that we have in the school that are able to join us today and give some of their perspective about what are the things that are happening within their organization that influence how resilient they might be and how that is helping them sort of weather this really sticky situation that almost every organization finds itself in now. So the three people we're going to cycle through with today. The first is Matt Busbridge. Matt did his MBA in 2009 and works for Amazon. We've got James Skoniak, who is one of our IMBA grads from 2017, and he is the EVP of Corporate Affairs and Operational Services at Bruce Power. It is the largest nuclear operating plant in North America. And then also we've got Larissa Chakowski from an MBA from 2004. She works with BMO in the U.S. wealth management side of the operations. So those are the three that we're going to cycle through and get some input on what's happening in their organizations.
Do you want to say a word about questions, Q&A, Dave?
Yeah, thanks for the prompt.
Yeah.
Because our time is really tight with this, and we've got a lot of things to kind of expose and dig into during this 60 minutes, what we're going to ask everyone that's logged on is if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A side of things. Throw your questions our way. I'll tell you with respect to timing, we won't have time during this 60 minutes to actually dig in and handle the questions, but immediately after, we're going to take a look at the questions that have been submitted, try and find some that are sort of kind of have common threads, fold a few together, the ones that we consider most salient. And myself, Martha, and the panelists will tap out a couple of responses, and we'll be able to share that with you tomorrow.
Great, thanks. So we're going to start with Matt Busbridge. So can we bring Matt on live? There you go. Hi, Matt.
Hey, Martha. Hey.
Good. Hey. So Matt, as we said earlier, is an MBA 2009. And as we say, he's a senior leader for Amazon Business and Strategic Engagement. He's also, if you go in his background, he has a history undergrad and then the Ivey MBA. And he's really passionate about bringing together public and private sector businesses and help using kind of the best of both to make everything better for people and for society. And you found a good way to do that at Amazon, right? Good to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks.
Matt, can you start by telling us just what is, happy global Ivey. Can you just start by telling us what is Amazon Business? We're all used to using Amazon as consumers, but what's the business side?
Sure. Amazon Business is just about 5 years old. We celebrated our birthday a couple of weeks ago, and it's the same Amazon experience that you and I know and love, that we order our peanut butter and our paper towels and our books on at home. That same user experience, but for businesses. We stumbled into this business kind of a little bit by accident, by noticing that businesses were going on, or business buyers were going onto their personal accounts and buying reams of paper and toner and stuff like that. And so we built a B2B experience for them called Amazon Business. Kind of think of it as an enterprise level account for your university or hospital or government in the public sector, or large or small commercial business in the private sector, where all employees can go into one central Amazon account and get whatever they need to do their jobs.
So it sounds great, and I can see how it's good for public sector and procurement, and also good for Amazon, of course, and good for the vendors too. It's great. Now, when we talked about resilience and a resilient story for Amazon, the business side and the public sector, you told me a great story about the Canadian federal government and the PPE. I wonder if you could share that story here.
Yeah, sure. It was announced in early April that the Canadian federal government and Amazon were going to work together to help get frontline workers across Canada the protective equipment that they needed. And backing up a couple of weeks from that announcement, the Canadian government came to us and said, look, we've got a problem. We have millions of pieces of PPE, but we don't really know how we can distribute them to government or hospitals in need. And Amazon, having a very robust fulfillment network, their hypothesis was maybe there's a partnership we could work on together. So within the span of 2 weeks, so we moved very, very quickly, we were able to take their PPE, ingest it into our system and in our warehouses, do spot checks on quality, and then give them the opportunity to both push that equipment out to folks that needed it across the country, but also give hospitals and governments, provincial and municipal governments, the ability to go onto the federal government's Amazon Business account and request those products. We did it at cost, so we didn't make any profit on this piece of work for the government, but it was a great example, I think, of a company like Amazon being able to move very, very quickly to help solve a really urgent problem on behalf of our customer.
Yeah, it's great, right? And of course, it's part of what we say thank you for, right? Getting all of that around the country. You make it sound very simple. Right? But you said 2 weeks, right? 2 weeks from the ask or the announcement till it was actually working. What were those 2 weeks like?
Very busy, sort of full-time work for a large team, but when I think about how Amazon is resilient in a crisis like this, it actually has equipped us very not easily, it equipped us to be able to do this quite effectively. And I think some of the reasons why that's the case is we are a customer obsessed company. It's one of our leadership principles. We constantly strive to do what's best for our customers. And this is a great example of that because it's so baked into how we think and we operate.
Yeah.
When the government came to us, it was kind of just, all hands on deck, let's get this done for them. And we also move very quickly as a business. We have we call it a bias for action, and speed matters. So again, because that's so baked into our culture, into our DNA, when we get big problems like that to solve, we can do so very, very quickly because we're used to it.
Yeah, yeah. This is where bricolage that we were playing with that I think Dave's going to come back to later, being able to run it. And we just had a comment, and I think we can't ignore the fact that there's also a lot of press and a lot of criticism for Amazon about how the workers in the warehouses are maybe not getting enough equipment themselves. So how does that tie into the resilience, and how do you as a leader in Amazon think about that and respond to that?
Yeah, I think very naturally, Amazon is a ubiquitous business, and we're kind of front and center in the news a lot of the time. So it's very natural that we take criticism on a wide variety of fronts, and I don't think we shy away from that. But when it comes to that criticism, I think I'd sort of draw that back to a statement from Jeff B., our founder, who very early on in Amazon's creation introduced the concept of it always being day one. And the idea behind that philosophy is our work is never done. A day two company is one with a lot of layers that moves very slowly, that can't experiment or try things very effectively. And by having that sort of day one philosophy, that forces us on a constant basis to experiment and try. And some of those things work and some of them don't. And we're not perfect by any means, but we're constantly testing and experimenting. And when things work very effectively, we double down on our investment, and when they don't, we move on. So I think in the context of that specific criticism, and how workers are treated in our fulfillment centers, I can only speak from my own experience, which is I've been to a number of these fulfillment centers across several different countries, and I can tell you those folks there are working so hard to get you and I everything we need when we need stuff to order from home, and they're working so diligently to get hospitals and governments the equipment that they need. We've tried to introduce a number of different things recently or initiatives recently to help them. So I think you might have read last week, we announced we're spending $4 billion between April and June. So that's a very short period of time to spend $4 billion, but all of that's designed to help get you and I the stuff that we order very quickly, but also to protect those workers. And we've got a number of other initiatives to help them in place as well.
So, and all of this is related to organizational resilience. Dave, did you want to jump in with a question? You have to unmute yourself though.
That might help, right? Hey, Matthew, I'm sorry, really interesting story. And I just think it's amazing you were able to do this in such a short window of time. I've seen a lot of rumblings in the press that Amazon is hiring lots of people, right? Because you're in that unique position where you're helping everyone else. But for you to be able to pull off what you just described, I'm guessing it takes a certain type of person. And I'm kind of interested, as you're upscaling and you're hiring all these people, how do you make sure you have the right people coming in that could actually want to work in an environment where every day is day one?
So the answer to that question, Dave, I think there's a couple of thoughts. One is, we're hiring, I think we've hired 175,000 people, or certainly are in the midst of that. So that is massive scale of hiring. Those are folks in our fulfillment centers and in our corporate offices. And the way that we're able to scale up that quickly is actually not something that's new. It goes back to how our culture is built. So we've got 14 leadership principles. Those leadership principles are how we make decisions, how we promote people, and also how we recruit and hire. So they're sort of a cultural benchmark, if you will. So when we're hiring across any role at Amazon, we're looking for talent who have displayed those leadership principles in their past work. And those leadership principles are things that I mentioned before, like bias for action and customer obsession. There are also things like invent and simplify and deliver results. And the thinking behind that is if you've demonstrated those leadership principles in your past work, you can come to Amazon and in a wide variety of different roles fit in our culture very successfully. And that's how you can make a very large company like Amazon actually feel very small in some ways from team to team and very consistent across the entire globe and multiple different very individual businesses.
And it's a great question, right? And then also be able to respond and pivot and bricolage and put together solutions from what you've got.
Yeah, we never really need to sort of stop and say, what should we do now? Because the leadership principle guide us and guide our decision making constantly.
Yeah. So this government one that you pulled together 2 weeks, it took a lot of people working full time, extra hours, I can imagine, doing it from home, right? Except for the fulfillment workers. You told me when we were talking on the phone that you were really proud to work at Amazon, and that this example made you really proud. Say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I love this particular example because I think it's a rare, it's a unique Amazonian accomplishment to be able to pull something of this scale off in such a short period of time. It makes me feel very proud that we were able to serve our frontline workers across the country and our government partners as effectively as we can. I love working for Amazon. I'm super proud of this and many other examples of that concept of customer obsession and constantly helping our customers. And we know that we have a very long-term perspective on our business. We know that by constantly focusing on helping our customers succeed in solving their problems over the long term, will create great loyalty and strong partnership and relationships.
So that's one of the things that I was curious about. You mentioned that you didn't make any profits on this one. You just did it at cost. Was that part of this long-term thinking as well? And is that part of your resilience as an organization?
Yeah, I think there are a number of different really good examples of ways that in the crisis we've been able to give back to communities large and small. And I think it's to foster great customer relationships over a period of time. It's also the right thing to do. So whether it's doing that particular business at cost and taking a massive team, just dedicating it to getting this done, hiring those people, we've also invested deeply in helping our own teams be safe in the workforce. And for the country music fans out there, Tim McGraw is doing a live stream on Prime Music tomorrow to raise awareness for the WHO's Solidarity Response Fund. So there are a lot of examples that make me very proud to be an Amazonian. And I know that we're constantly making decisions for the benefit of our customer over the profit for Amazon.
Matt, could I ask a question? You know, when you have a feat like you pulled off in that 2 weeks, it's phenomenal. What do you do inside the organization to celebrate this, to let others see and let that success shine across the rest of the organization?
You know, it's I'm not sure we always stop and take the opportunity to celebrate those wins necessarily. We don't often pat each other on the back. It's not kind of part of our culture, actually. Instead, what we did in that particular situation, Dave, is we shared that model with a number of other state, provincial, even other federal government customers around the world to say, here's an example of what we were able to build given a really challenging, urgent problem. Is there a way that we can scale this to other customers to be able to help them? So I think, again, we don't really pat ourselves on the back. Instead, we look for opportunities to scale these complex problems that we've solved.
Understand.
We got like a minute left, Matt. What have you learned about resilience over the last 8 weeks?
You know, I think I think it comes down to being able to move very quickly, put aside or focus in on what's best for the customer. And again, those are not new things for us, but I think in context of the last few weeks and the experience that we've had during the crisis and our ability to respond, having stayed very true to those is how we've been able to be successful. And I think the concept of experiments and trying new things, again, part of Amazon's culture, has also kind of been something that has worked very successfully for us, I'd say.
Good, thank you. So the resilience is already there. You keep doing what you're doing, even in this new reality, and leverage it even more. So stay true to who you are and leverage it even more. This is great lessons. Thank you. Thanks very much. Dave, we're going to go to a different context now, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. We're going to switch gears a little bit. Thanks again, Matt. What we're going to do now is I want to shift into a quick discussion with James Skoniak. I told you that he's at Bruce Power. Let me tell you a little bit more about James. He's the EVP of Corporate Affairs and Operational Services at Bruce Power. He's a member of the executive team responsible for corporate affairs there. He also, in his role, has been very kind of involved in the site lease issue and how far they're going to carry on, as well as the isotope development. That's one of the strange things that not everyone knows about Bruce Power, is that they're not just generating electricity, but they're also providing a lot of medical isotopes. And I think, James, I saw that 40% of all the surgical tools that are used in North America are somehow sanitized with isotopes that come from Bruce Power, right?
Yeah, that's right. It's one of the, as Canadians, we do a good job of sometimes not sharing all the good news. But that's right. We provide about 40% of an isotope called cobalt-60. So if you go into your doctor's office and they open up a package and there's a sterile medical supply in there, chances are that's been irradiated with our cobalt somewhere around the world.
Is that right? Okay. Well, awesome. And thanks again, James, for being able to join us. I know how busy you are and how busy things are up there at the site. So thanks for the time for this. I'm going to just ask you, I'm going to give you a little bit of a prompt and I'll let you sort of grab the thread and run with it. But earlier this week, when we were chatting about how we would use the 15 minutes that we had with you, James, and I was kind of prompting you to think about, do you have any kind of stories or examples where you've seen resilience being demonstrated at Bruce Power? And very quickly, you pivoted into this notion of what you do at Bruce Power in focusing not just on the internal, but also the external. And to be honest, it took me about a minute to get my head wrapped around what you were talking about. But once I got it, I thought, wow, this is a very interesting perspective. So I'm wondering if you can just kind of flesh that out a bit for us. What does it mean to look at the internal and the external?
Sure. No, absolutely. And I think the way, and thanks very much for having me, and great to be part of this panel discussion today. So, I mean, firstly, you sort of think about where our facility is. We're in rural southwestern Ontario. So we're a large operation, Canada's largest private sector funded infrastructure project, nuclear facility, and we're in the middle of small town rural Ontario. So as you can imagine, we're very close knit, connected to the community. So that's sort of a cultural value of us in terms of social responsibility. But I think more broadly, when you think about COVID, oftentimes when, all of our businesses have emergency plans and business continuity plans, for whatever business you're in, we have those plans. And I think what has been unique about a pandemic of this nature is the first thing organizations want to do is go to their business continuity or their emergency plans. But typically those plans are very internally focused. And the external elements related to that tend to be around reputation or regulators or stakeholders. And so when we, it's 60 days as of this Sunday since COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic, and we had stood up our business continuity emergency response center before that, we made a concerted effort to really ensure that the way we were tackling this, David, was consistent with a pandemic. And in a pandemic, you just can't look at your own operation and say, if we take care of all the people in our operation, we're okay. Because our employees, may go home and their spouse could be a doctor or a nurse. They may go in the community to pick up food. All of the things that limit the spread of COVID, that manage a pandemic, you have to look more broadly. So what we did very quickly and early on was we established an organizational priority that we were going to direct as much resources offsite as we did on-site. And that was to ensure the region, the institutions, organizations had the capacity that they needed to respond to the event. Because we could get a 10 out of, we could do everything perfectly on site, but if the community wasn't well positioned outside a site, it wouldn't matter. Not to mention, you have your employees and you want to take care of their families, their loved ones, and their neighbors, our retirees, and the broader community. So what we did was we set up our response with both an internal and external focus, David.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this was to me very interesting, because I hadn't thought about this until we had chatted earlier in the week, that you said when people get in trouble or an organization's in a crisis, it's a very instinctual thing to kind of pull together and hunker in, and maybe even work a little bit on the insulation that protects you, right? And I do think that's a very natural kind of internal focus. But you're saying it was a strategic decision on your side to allocate just as many resources outside of the organization as inside, right? And as I said, it took me a while to kind of get my head wrapped around this, but I want to be very clear, and I'd like to sort of unpack this for everyone that's listening today, is that this wasn't just about being a good citizen. There's payback for you as well as an organization, because when people come to work, they ready to put in that 8 or whatever hour shift for you. If you've worked on some of the external issues that could be causing anxiety and worry for them, they're more likely to be able to demonstrate a solid 8 hours for you. And given how important safety is in your industry, which we're all glad that you take it so seriously, you're less likely to have accidents. People can be safer because they're coming into work with kind of a clearer head instead of worrying about all that external stuff. Right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, I mean, I'll just give you one example. You know, if we think about safety culture, right? You know, an employee who drives to work over the speed limit, who doesn't follow any of the rules, and they're going to work, they're not going to all of a sudden become a safety conscious employee the day they drive onto your site. So we've always have looked at this as a cultural on and off the job kind of element. But yeah, it's you know, you really have to look at this for the entirety of what COVID is. It's a public health challenge, so you have to deal with it on a public health basis. You know, we very quickly mobilized our supply chain network to make one of the largest private sector donations of PPE, 1.2 million pieces of PPE procurement, retooling within 30 days. That made sure that not only across Ontario, but in our area, that people had personal protective equipment. You know, as a company, you want to make sure that not only your employees have personal protective equipment, but if one of your employees has to go to the emergency room, that the nurse or doctor who is seeing them, that they have personal protective equipment. That's just really common sense. Right. But you also have to recognize in a lot of areas of rural Ontario and northern Canada or western Canada, you know, the institutions of government are not as large as they are in urban centers, whether it's hospitals. And so sometimes we also assume that the healthcare system has the capability for procurement, for logistics. You know, we put in place 150 pop-up hospital beds in the area. But you're right, it was a strategic decision, not only because it's the right thing to do, but you also need to know that people's heads are in the game, not only for safety, but in terms of business resiliency. And that's really the topic of today. And, you know, issues like mental health, are people's, you know, kids and loved ones taken care of. Those are all really, really important things. And you're fooling yourself if you think you can do everything right in your own facility. And one of the things I always like to say is, you know, a lot of people pay attention to the government essential services list, and that's great. We're an essential service, obviously. But in a Western democracy, if an employee does not want to come to work, whether that's a nurse, whether that's somebody at Bruce Power, whether that is somebody providing if you're an essential service and you don't want to come to work, there's not a lot an employer can do. Right? That's our society, and that's okay. So you have in hospitals and all these other organizations, people making a decision to come in. And they're coming into work when they don't want to. Let's be honest. You'd rather, you know, especially when this was unknown, you want to be at home with your loved ones, but they're making a decision to come in. And so I think that from organizational resiliency, there's two important strategic elements to that. Strategic element number one is people have to know why they're coming into work. And we were very clear with people, you come to work, we're going to put all the safety precautions in place, but you're coming to work to power Ontario through the pandemic. You're coming to work, so we get that cobalt shipment out. You know, we did a cobalt shipment in the month of March, enough cobalt to sterilize 13 billion, that's with a B, 13 billion surgical gloves around the world. So our folks very much felt like they were a part of that fight. But also, you know, we want to make sure we're taking care of as many of those things as possible, making sure people have access to a doctor through a virtual app. So if they have a loved one that is not feeling well, they can get healthcare services right away and keep that capacity available, but also make sure we're doing all the right things in the community so people know what to do. So yeah, it was a very comprehensive effort, but it also goes to broadly what the business community in Canada has done. And I don't think it's just Bruce Power. I think the private sector has stepped up in an unprecedented way. You know, you look at Omer's pension plan as one of our big owners, TC Energy, they've stepped up. But a number of months ago, or sort of early in this process, the Business Council of Canada, the top CEOs of the country, where our CEO was a signatory, said we need to mobilize the entire private sector to fight this. And I think this is also about recognizing we just can't leave it to government or volunteers. We all have to do our bit. And so sometimes a larger company like Bruce Power gets a lot of recognition, and we're honored about that. But you know, you see it all throughout Canada. Small businesses of 15, 20 people, you know, making face shields. So you know, everybody in a pandemic is doing what they can and trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. Fantastic. As I mentioned yesterday, you shared a couple of stories about how this approach of focusing on the external has kind of manifested. And I have to tell you, one of the stories just really hit me in the gut. It was this notion of, for many of us that have parents that are a little older and they might be living in an assisted living facility or a nursing home, those facilities are all basically locked down and you just can't get in to see your loved ones anymore. And it struck someone within Bruce Power that you could address that by buying iPads for all the elder care facilities in your county, right? So everyone can use this iPad to FaceTime with their kids. And it's just this notion of trying to get rid of a little bit of the noise outside in their daily lives so that when they come in, you got an individual who's willing to give that really solid 8 hours because you've worked on some of the things that typically distract them, right?
Yeah, that's right. And it's things that we take for granted, you know, and it's also with an execution focus, right? You don't have weeks and weeks to think about this stuff. So putting it into our emergency management organization, you have very clear command and control. And I don't mean to sound, you know, authoritarian with that, but it's if we're going to do it, we go and do it and we execute it, right? It's not good a month from now. It's got to be within 24 hours. And so putting it within that emergency management organization really helps with that rigor, because what you do is if you say it's a priority, it was one of our top 4 priorities as a business in response to the situation, it means you put the full organizational weight behind it. And I can tell you, it makes a difference. It makes a difference if an employee can FaceTime with a loved one who's in a long-term care home they're worried about before they go to work. That's not a small thing. You can put whatever mental health programs in place you want. If you've got a loved one in a long-term care home and they can't communicate, there's no mental health tools to help you around that. And so it's about taking a broader approach, but a bias towards execution.
Got it. Martha, do you have a question?
Well, my question was going to be, how do you organize for that? How do you mobilize it? It's one thing to make the decision and have leaders make the decisions to do these things, but how do you organize and mobilize? Did you already have it in place? And it sounds like did you already have an emergency management group and and they were assigned to do this?
Yeah, that's right. And we operating a nuclear facility, we do spend a lot of time on emergency management. So we have that structure set up. And so the structure can be stood up for a pandemic, an earthquake, an ice storm, you name it. And so what it was really about was setting up, you know, we had 4 priorities in the Emergency Management Center in terms of keeping employees safe, reliable operations, completing essential plant work, and ensuring external capability. And so what you do is you use the same principles of operating a nuclear plant around who's got what. So, you know, somebody's in charge of personal protective equipment, somebody's in charge of long-term care homes, somebody's in charge of communications, working. So you set that up, and it's I always call it a who, by, what, by, when model. And making decisions. But you know, we put the best people on, we put a structure around it, we prioritize it, and then you use the infrastructure of the company to execute against that. And it's not a massive cost, but it's a profound difference. You know, our CEO called Premier Ford on a radio show on April 1st and said, we are going to set an ambitious goal of securing and making 600,000 pieces of personal protective equipment for frontline healthcare workers across Ontario. This mobilization, it wasn't just Bruce Power, it was our supply chain and our employees really dedicated. By the 30th of April, we had doubled that to 1.2 million pieces of PPE. And we thought 600,000 was ambitious on April 1st. But it goes to show you, it's also about sometimes getting out of people's way, right? And one of the things, the pandemic, I'll tell you, there are things in Bruce Power, barriers we have broken down that will serve us well long-term. I'm not saying there's anything great about a pandemic, but organizations have become not only more resilient, but more agile in this process. And it teaches us that when we have a tighter deadline and we have something like a pandemic where you're talking about somebody's life or a health and safety thing, it goes to show you how much quicker you can implement things. And so resiliency is not just about what the organization does, You only have a resilient organization if you have resilient people.
Yeah.
And I always like to say, we're in the people business. If we were running a gas plant, we would have 400 people on site, not 4,000. Now, we're still a more cost competitive source of electricity, but that's a different debate.
Yeah.
So we're in the people business. It's not about making nuclear power. It's about those 4,100 people. Are their heads in the game? Are they doing the right things? When they do the right things, we do great things. And so we're not in the nuclear business, we're in the people business.
All right, James, I know I'm a little bit over, but I'm gonna ask you one quick question since it's Global Ivey Day. And your EMBA is not too far back. It's just about 3 years. You can probably remember everything that you read in that program, right?
I remember everything I read. I don't remember what I didn't read.
Yeah, well, you're giving me a face like I'm going to give you a pop quiz.
Okay.
Instead, let's talk generally. You know, when you look back on that 16 months you spent in the EMBA program, like what did you pull from the Ivey program specifically that helps you lead during times like this?
Well, I think what can happen with all of us, I'm guilty of it, is we get very focused in our sector. We get very focused in our business, and we sometimes forget about those things around us. And so what I learned more than anything was a broader appreciation for, you know, other business challenges from other sectors, other companies. And so for me, what that does is when we're in a situation like this, we don't get in that tunnel vision. Right? We think about, well, hey, if Amazon can do that, why can't we do that? And so I know that's a kind of a soft answer to your question, but what it does is it broadens your perspective, understanding other business challenges. And what you begin to learn is whether you're making nuclear power, or you're making shoes, or you're in Amazon or Google, they're actually the same issues. It's all about people. Yeah. And it's all about how you mobilize and direct that.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome, James. Thank you. And thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, James.
Martha,
thanks for having me.
It's really, really inspirational. And I'm starting to see some patterns, right, between Amazon and Bruce Power, even though you're very, very different organizations, right? There's some commonalities about what we already have in our DNA, what's our purpose, and then how do we take that and repurpose it, and resilient people to the resilient organization. Mm-hmm. Why don't we turn now to banking and Larissa? So again, a very, very different industry that's been really on the front lines, resilient during this pandemic. And welcome to Larissa Tchaikovsky. Larissa is MBA from 2004, the second last year of the 2-year MBA, I think, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So great to have you here. She's currently the Chief Operating Officer of the U.S. Wealth Management arm of Bank of Montreal, BMO. And through her career, she's had senior roles in HR as well as strategy, a lot about human capital. So it's a really interesting path towards the operations. She's absolutely passionate about empowering people to perform at their best, and then very pragmatic also about getting the outcomes. I also want to say Larissa is one of our Ivey Academy certified coaches. She's part of our coaching community. And so, you know, her background tells you something about the unique kind of coaching community that we have. So welcome. Great to have you here, Larissa.
Thanks, Martha. Pleased to be here.
Yeah. You're going to focus overall at BMO, not just about the wealth management part, right? Because you've had a lot of different roles in BMO. And also, I understand from what you said that you've all been working together a lot during this crisis.
I would say, and you know, it's interesting just building off of what Matt and James were saying. This is an unprecedented time to break down the walls in any company. You know, you have to mobilize every resource that you have to operate at the speed we've needed to. And so there's no more wealth versus commercial versus retail banking. We are all one. We've talked that game a long time. And I would say what we've managed to accomplish in the last 8 to 12 weeks is actually real, right? We've actually made it happen in a way I would say we haven't in the past.
Wow. That's great. And you guys have been really, really busy with a lot of things. You're behind the scenes on so many pieces of this. One of the places where you're behind the scenes making things work is the new government programs, all of the government relief programs. So how has that affected what your operations and how have the banks stepped up on that?
It's a really interesting thing to think about. And it's a little bit different in Canada than in the US. I would say in Canada, the banks are a little bit more part of the social fabric of the country. Whereas in the US, you have thousands of independent banks. You don't have the oligopoly that you would have in Canada. But it's really quite interesting because we have this paradox taking place right now where we are at the center really of trying to keep the economy going. We are the conduit for things like the PPP program in the US and the CEBA program in Canada. And at the same time, trying to make sure we keep the banking system completely stable. Without a lot of guidance, we're, pulling together these programs to distribute billions, almost $1 trillion now in the US, out to clients and customers across a network, some of which are clients already, some are new customers to us that we don't even know. And so we've had to come together quickly and really understand how we can actually be that channel on behalf of the government to get the money into the hands of the people who need it most right now.
So that sounds completely overwhelming to me. How do you make that real?
There's a couple of things I will say. One is, and we talk about resilience and coming back to that. We have a purpose at BMO. It's very strong, and we are a company that's over 200 years old, and it's to boldly grow the good in business and life. And so we have held this up as the reason why we are asking people to come into the office. We've had employees, when these PPP programs came out, you literally had 48 hours to key in the information from, tens of thousands of clients. And so they were working around the clock in their homes, coming into the office. But we kept pointing back to, this is why we're here, actually. In this moment, in this time, we've never been more important to every client that we already have and every customer that we could have. And this is not about profitability, by the way. This is not about, growing our business. This is about the life part. This is about really helping. And I have to say, one of the things is this was authentic for us. This is not something we created all of a sudden because we were in the middle of this, unprecedented pandemic. This is the way we've been operating for a long time, but it manifested itself in a bit of a different way, perhaps on an elevated, more global scale than it would have with some of the smaller proof points that we would have had in the past.
Wow. And I bet you've been pretty busy yourself.
There's not been a lot of sleep. Yeah, no, for sure. But, it's, it actually feels really good to know we're helping. And I'm not all sunshine, rainbows, and unicorns, right? Banks are interesting parts of our society. However, in this case, I actually think we're doing a lot of good work, and we are not only trying to get the money into hands, but also helping our customers and clients who have lost their jobs, who are on furloughs, who, have been laid off. How can we help those, members of our community bridge the gap that they're about to face from a financial perspective, while also recognizing that, we as a company also need to be stable and not take any undue risk, because the long-term implications actually are quite consequential. And so, balancing that, but, it does feel good to talk to somebody and say, look, you don't need to pay your mortgage for 3 or 4 months while we sort through this. And we will help you as much as we can to get through this situation.
It's amazing. And so I have a couple of different kind of question streams that come out of that. One is, so banks are big and regulated and bureaucratic, right? So how do you so I have a whole bunch of questions about how you did this. The other set of questions is, like Amazon, right? There's a lot of press that banks are being greedy and not so helpful right now. So given what you've just said, how do you keep resilient in the face of that? So you can answer those in whichever order you want.
I'll start with the first piece of it, which was really around like, how do you kind of mobilize around this? And it's been interesting for us, and it echoes a little bit of what Matt was talking about earlier. We had to forget a lot of what has made us successful up until this point in time. If you look back at the 2009 financial crisis, banks were in the center of that for sure. But part of why, in particular, the Canadian banks weathered that storm better than others was because we were highly regulated. We had all of these control mechanisms in place. Big banks are the most bureaucratic type of organizations, basically, that exist. And so in this pandemic crisis, what we've had to do is almost take everything we've ever believed in, from those perspectives. And I won't say throw them out the window, but certainly take a very different perspective on them and take those tools that have made us successful in the past and actually, you know, almost flip them on their head and say, okay, if we weren't as bureaucratic, if we look at this as a system and implement trust and say, look, you know, in the past, we would have required an actual signature and seeing our client in this situation. Okay, what if we get an email? We have to trust that that's going to be okay. And sometimes that's hard in a bank where, you know, we've held up for many years. Oh, the regulators won't, you know, support that. And they're doing their job. We're doing our job. But we're putting a lot of trust right now and throwing out a lot of what has made us successful in the past to be able to innovate and pull things together very quickly. Things that would have taken us 18 to 24 months in the past and I won't say tens of millions, but many millions of dollars to implement. In 6 weeks to 8 weeks, we now have things like digital signature capabilities. Wow. And so, you know, to make them sustainable will take some work, but these are things we never would have been able to do in the past. And so, but we've had to really change our paradigm.
Question your assumptions, and
that's absolutely correct. As for the, you know, the questions around the criticism of banks, and of course we're not perfect, but one of the things we have to do is really acknowledge where the feedback is coming from and have empathy from where that's coming from and really say, why are people questioning the actions of the banks? Why are they giving us this feedback? There's often, as we all know, two sides of the story. And so we acknowledge when we hear that type of feedback and we balance it with what we're actually doing. And so, you know, it's important that we don't sweep the feedback under the rug. It's important that we talk about it internally. We have what we call contextual and transparent on authentic communication, opportunities for our employees to give us two-way feedback on what they're hearing out in the market. But at the same time, you know, also balancing with the good that we are in fact doing in our communities. And, you know, there's proof points. You probably, you know, those of you in Canada just heard about the partnership with the MLSE, where, you know, turning BMO Field into a giant kitchen. In the US, we've committed another, you know, millions of dollars to the United Way and the housing programs that they have. And so, you know, we are aware that this will be a challenging time for everybody, and we acknowledge that, but we also balance it.
Well, and also thinking about where some of the feedback comes from, people are feeling really uncertain right now, and they, of course, right? It's not just in your head. There is real uncertainty. That's what VUCA is, and part of that is going to be taken out on the bankers, of course, because they're afraid.
You know, one of the things I absolutely, and our own employees are afraid too. Right. Like, and we're asking them to come. We are an essential service. We are open for business. We have a lot of employees coming into work every day. But we also talk about how thankful we are to be an essential service right now. You know, that people have the privilege to come into work and the ability to help our clients in a way that many others just can't do right now because of the nature of the businesses they are in. And so it is true, we are going into an unprecedented place of fear, unknown, really not being able to predict what's going to happen next. Everybody wants a lot of answers, right? Those answers don't exist today because we just don't know what's going to happen next. And we try to acknowledge that actually very regularly internally.
You mentioned the word empathy. I was really struck by your use of the word empathy when we were talking. Yeah, the importance of having empathy for those perspectives.
Yeah.
Leadership. Dave, did I see you trying to jump in there?
No, nothing specific. Okay. I'm nodding my head. I'm just thinking it's very honorable what you're doing. And it doesn't always line up, Larissa, with kind of my knee-jerk reaction when I think about banks. I love to hear about this kind of shift in perspective. I think it's fantastic. It's odd to say, and I want to be really careful, but you know, none of us would have wished this situation on anyone. But if you're like us, like at Ivey, it's actually, I wouldn't call it a silver lining, but it's helped us figure a couple of things out, given the context of it, that I don't think we would have figured out about ourselves. And I'm sure you're doing the same thing.
Yeah, the pace of innovation that will happen right now and in the next, let's say 6 months, I think will be exponential to what it would have been had this not happened.
Yeah. On the Ivey side, I could probably count about 50 things that I've seen happen in this organization over the last 60 days that before you would have always said that could never work. And guess what? We had to do it, and it worked, right?
It worked. Yeah.
Yeah.
People are open to it. Larissa, thank you very, very much. Really, really interesting and helpful perspectives on that. And thanks also for the work that you and everybody else at BMO and the other banks are doing to help get things from governments to people and helping clients. We know it's an uncertain time for everybody, but we appreciate it. Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Larissa.
Thanks, Larissa.
Dave, I think we got some lessons we can pull together, right?
We do.
Across all of these.
Martha and I have a couple of thoughts we'd like to share at the end. So with your permission, I'm going to move to some slides. And by the way, we'll send these slides out to everyone that bothered to log on today, tomorrow. So don't feel like you've got to take notes, not that you would have anyway, but just wanted to mention a few things that we were thinking about as far as how we could fold these different stories together and develop somewhat of a better understanding about what it is that makes organizations more rather than less resilient and able to kind of weather the storms that might be coming towards them. So I'm going to give you just a really quick background in the sense that back in November of 2019, I was asked to give a talk at a large HR conference, and it's kind of fortuitous. They tapped me and they said, we really want you to do something on resilience, right? This was in November when we had no idea what kind of storm was looming for us. But I dug in and started doing some reading in this area around resilience. And actually, I have to tell you, it's probably not going to be the case a year from now, because I think a lot of researchers are focusing on organizational resilience. But most of what's been done in the past has looked at a different level of analysis. It's been focused on individual resilience, what it is that makes some individuals more likely, you knock them down, they're going to get right back up and continue forward. And in this research, if I tell you this, it's a little dark, but you'll probably understand how appropriate the context is. A lot of that research on individual resilience was rooted in trying to understand how some people that have similar physical characteristics were able to survive the internment time that they had in the concentration camps in World War II, while others did not. And like I said, it's a pretty dark sort of setting, but you can imagine that there was some variance there in how people were going through these horrible situations, and some weren't able to kind of make it through, whereas others were. And when they did a lot of kind of field research and thinking about how to dig in and understand why that's the case, there were kind of three things that were consistently mentioned around why it is individuals can be more resilient rather than less. First is this notion of having this unwavering acceptance of reality. So basically not trying to sugarcoat the situation that you're in. I want to be very clear that optimism, I think, is still important here, but sometimes optimism kind of bleeds over a little bit into almost delusion, right? And that doesn't help. Right? So just being able to kind of really accept the situation instead of wishing yourself out of it, that's one of the individual characteristics. Another is this notion of trying to find meaning and belief in what you're experiencing. So a good way to kind of think about that is that notion when sometimes people get into a crisis or into trouble, they might be the kind of individuals that throw their hands up and say, why me? Why is this happening to me? Whereas the more resilient individuals were the ones that didn't just ask that question, but they were saying, so why am I here? Like, is there any deeper meaning or purpose for why I'm going through something like this? And that was a characteristic of resilience. And the third one is this notion of being able to kind of muddle through and cobble together solutions with imperfect information and resources. So it's this ability to improvise. And Martha's used this phrase a few times, this notion of bricolage, this idea that, you may not have everything you need to do your job perfectly, but you're going to make it work with whatever you have in front of you. And so these were the three characteristics of individuals. And my thought was that we could probably shift and bump this a little bit, the level of analysis, and start thinking about what it is that organizations can do that can influence their resiliency. So we've got this notion of three things that really influence how resilient your organization can be. One is kind of tapping into this notion of facing into the reality that you are, steeped in. I think in some organizations, we like to protect the core and insulate them from the harsh realities of outside because we think it could be distracting for people on a daily basis. But what we're finding is that these resilient organizations, they make sure everyone that works inside really understands the current state of affairs. So it's not just that happy talk kind of communication, it's the realities about how our customers feel about us, whether or not our employees are as engaged and motivated as they could be. But there's just a stronger sense of everyone knows what we're facing and it's shared collectively instead of just existing in different pockets of the organization. With respect to the second one around searching for meaning, I think that we all understand that, with shifts in demography, people want to work for organizations that have a purpose, that there's a reason for their existence. And a lot of times in some industries, it's easier for people to see that there's value in what they're doing and that there's an actual purpose. But in others, it's not always so apparent. And I think good, resilient organizations have leaders that will make sure that every job within that organization is viewed as having value, right? So that people have a sense of what they're doing actually matters. And then the third one around this kind of ritualized ingenuity, again, this phrase bricolage, it's about getting people to think about how they could operate in a context where perhaps they don't have everything that they need. We think that organizations can be more proactive about that, and in their training and development programs, actually fold in a little bit more of this innovation side of things, so that when people run into a sticky situation and they don't have that perfect set of resources and as much time as they might like to make decisions, that they learn how to be more agile and to work with what they have, because there's a good chance in these sort of crisis situations, you won't have every tool and as much time as you might need to do things. Just one last thing about this bricolage part is that a lot of the research shows that it's not just about getting people to be more creative. Sometimes one of the biggest challenges has to do with getting them to drop their existing tools and processes. And if they've been a big part of your success in the past, sometimes it's hard to let go of that because that's part of your identity. So this notion of building more bricolage in the people that work inside, it's not just about creativity. Sometimes it's about taking away some of the things that they rely on for success to see what they would do in the absence of it. So our thought is that when organizations can start driving on these three dimensions, they're not only going to impact their ability to deal with current crises, but they're building in some ways, almost like this resiliency shield that can really be a big part of them being successful in the future. As yesterday, as Martha and I were kind of sorting out how we wanted to wrap things up, Martha had a fantastic observation. And so our last...
Yeah, before you go to the last slide, I just want to connect back. I think from the three guests that we had here today, we saw all three of these. I noticed in listening to them, we heard a lot more about the second two, the meaning and the bricolage, than we did about the reality. And I think the thing is, in the current crisis, the reality is all around us. Yeah. Right. And so we're all facing that. And so then it's a lot about how you talk about the reality. Right. But I think what's differentiating these firms and the firms that are being resilient is much more in those second two right now. Absolutely. Right. And we really heard about both of those in a lot from all three of our guests today. And I think it's interesting to see it across these very, very different contexts, to see both of this search for meaning and bricolage. The North American word for that is MacGyvering. I love that word too. Right? It's the same thing, right? Perfect, right? Yeah. Yeah. But no, as you said, when we listened to them, I was really struck, and it reminded me of a statement that I once heard a leader say, that nobody ever outperformed for rational reasons. Extraordinary performance takes emotion. And all three of the guests, when we spoke with them in preparation and again today, we heard a lot of pride, a lot of emotion, a lot of deep engagement. And they talked about trust and words like that. And so I just wanted to come back to what we heard here and what we've seen with resilient organizations is that resilience, when it's used, kind of creates this virtuous cycle of creating more resilience. And so resilience as an organization, when we support our staff in being more resilient as individuals and organizationally, it actually builds more resilience. That resilience creates pride, it creates innovation, and it creates extraordinary performance. Not just meeting expectations. That's where you need your, your systems and your goals and all of that kind of stuff, and your rewards. But this extraordinary performance takes emotional engagement, and the resilience can really get you that emotional engagement. And I think we were really seeing this across companies. And as James said, not just the three companies that we talked with, but a lot of companies right now.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. Right. I love this notion, how you kind of put that dynamic spin on it, right? I think it would be very naive of us to think that once we get through this particular situation, that we'll never have another crisis. This is about learning from these situations, folding it in, and making ourselves even better able to face whatever is going to be coming next year. Yeah.
And inspiring. It's very inspiring.
Absolutely. All great stories. So Mark, I saw you came back on.
You going to conclude us?
Just so humbled. Like, I love the Ivey Network, man. That's so
Yeah.
humbled by all these stories. They're fantastic. Every time I hear them, I'm so proud to be part of the network. Some nice comments that came in throughout. One of them was actually from Mark Whitmore. Mark wrote the very first support check 11 years ago on behalf of Deloitte. Without him, Global Ivey Day would never be here, and we wouldn't be here. So big shout out to Mark and everybody else that was part of it back in the day. And lots of candidates for the president of the new Matt and Larissa and James fan club. We'll pass those names along to you. You can vet them yourselves if you like. For everybody out there, for Dave and for Martha, fantastic job. If you have a chance to find your way into a program led by these two, you can't possibly go wrong. But biggest thank you is to our guests, Matt and Larissa and James. I meant it. I'm really humbled by what you said, and just you made us all proud. Thanks for joining us. We're up against it on time, as we always are. We didn't get to any of the questions that came through. We'll do our best to follow up after the fact. But to everyone that tuned in and everyone that joined us today, thanks so much, and happy Global Ivey Day.
Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Be safe, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Be safe. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Mm-hmm.